Hi, John. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, Maytal.
I guess let's start by actually explaining to people what they're watching and what we're doing here. And thank you so much for joining me. We have had our policy center, the JSpaceCanada Policy Centre, which you are the chair of, among many other much more impressive accolades that you hold. And we've been doing that for about a year and a half. And, putting out policy papers, we find that folks are quite engaged in those. And so we kind of thought, why don't we expand that to some of the conversations that you and I have when we are putting those policy papers together, or when we're touching base talking about what's going on in the region and how Canada is reacting to what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Why don't we bring those conversations directly to our supporters? We're calling this the JSpaceCanada Policy Space, and it's just going to be a chance, I think, for us every couple of weeks to bring those conversations directly to the folks who are already engaged with our policy center, the folks who are interested in hearing, why when we put out policy papers, why are we saying the things that we're saying? How are we reaching the conclusions that we're reaching? And I think that you and I will probably, we don't always agree. I think that's my favorite part of us writing those papers together, is that, we have that back and forth and we have that dialogue. And I'm always so appreciative and grateful for what I learned from you during those times. And I think that I would love for others to have the opportunity to do the same and to kind of, see if they agree, disagree with us. So we'll upload this to our YouTube channel every time we have these conversations and send it out via email. And we'll probably, who knows where it'll go? Maybe we can have some guests from time to time. Maybe we can have some folks join us and ask their questions of us. But I think, I'm really excited to dig into this with you for 2026 and beyond.
Thanks. I'm also excited. Actually, we agree about 98% of the
Yep.
time, and I'm really looking forward to these conversations. So why don't we get right down to it?
Yeah, let's do it. So let me start. I'll ask you, and then I'll give you my answer too. But since we are at the beginning of the year, which we're 6 days into it, and it has not been boring, um, let's talk about. I'm interested to hear from you. What are kind of maybe the two stories that stood out to you from 2025, and what are you looking forward to, or what are you keeping your eye on in 2026?
Well, there were so many stories in 2025. I mean, I think in some ways the most important one was the announcement of the Trump peace plan because it ended the devastating bombing and destruction in Gaza, and it allowed the hostages to come home. So I think that was hugely important. Of course, I guess we'll talk about where we are in respect of that plan and phase one or two, etc. But I think that was momentous. And obviously, the conflict between Israel and Iran was huge. It was really the first time that these two states, which have been at each other verbally and in certain ways, not so verbally, have actually engaged in rocket attacks at each other, leading to multiple deaths. And of course, that led to the U.S. Israel bombing of Iran and efforts to take out their nuclear capabilities. So I'd say those were probably the two main ones, and I guess we're going to talk about it. But Canada has stepped up its commentary and criticism and actions in the region, and maybe we'll come back to that towards the end.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good. What about how do you see either of those things going, both the ceasefire and potential future escalations with Iran in 2026? What are you keeping your eye on?
Well, in terms of the phase two of the peace plan, which we were all hoping would actually be in place by now, I'm getting more and more cynical. I think, first of all, neither Bibi Netanyahu nor Hamas wanted that peace plan and would have preferred to continue as they were with Hamas holding the hostages and with Bibi continuing the war. They were forced into it essentially by Donald Trump. Trump using his pressure tactics with Muslim countries, Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, and using his tactics, the same tactics with Bibi. So now we're in a situation with Israel controlling 53% of Gaza and Hamas essentially in control of the rest, and not high likelihood of moving to that next phase. The next phase, of course, requires, on the one hand, disarmament or at least decommissioning of the major weapons of Hamas, and on the other hand, the beginning of withdrawal of Israel. Nobody seems to want to engage Hamas. The Muslim countries that were supposed to be part of this international stabilization force have indicated they don't want to disarm Hamas, get involved in battles with them. And I was told by Alon Liel, a former Director General of the Foreign Ministry in Israel, former ambassador to South Africa, that in conversations he had recently with Mahmoud Abbas, the PA also does not want to disarm Hamas. Mm-hmm. So we've got a problem if this sort of fundamental element of the beginning of the next phase doesn't get into operation. And then there's the other problems of the International Stabilization Force, who's going to form it, and what is the role of the Stabilization Force? Is it going to, as we sort of thought perhaps, bring rule of law and disarm Hamas? Is it going to be just a peacekeeping force, a traditional peacekeeping force where once everything is calm, it comes in and maintains the calm? Or is it going to be something else? We really don't know. And I think I'll just finish on saying this is all dependent on Donald Trump keeping the pressure on and moving this forward. And the concerns in the international community were always that he has a very short focus. He's now focused on Venezuela. Witkoff and Kushner, his two envoys, are focused on Ukraine, and Marco Rubio is National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, and maybe or maybe not going to be running Venezuela soon, probably not, but certainly
and going after Cuba.
And going after Cuba and maybe Colombia.
Sure.
So, unfortunately, I'm normally a glass half full person, but I'm not sure that phase two, as we hoped it would develop, is happening next week or next month.
Yeah. I think we'll talk a little bit more. Let's get a little bit more in depth on the ceasefire a little bit later on. But I will just say, to kind of add to what you were saying, I read something that I thought was interesting quite a few months back where I can't remember who it was, but it was a Palestinian writer who made the comment that, in many ways it is possible. It was the most pessimistic thing I had read, but since you're in your glass half empty phase, I'll mention it. He said, it is, it's a distinct possibility that the war between Israel and Hamas will be the last war for Israel, not because it will usher in a dawn of peace, but because we will just it will be a new normal for Israel to, maintain this kind of baseline war of attrition that never really stops. And even that's what we're seeing now, right? Like, people talk about the war being over and a ceasefire, et cetera, but like we see on the ground with what's happening in Gaza, I mean, there's still attacks every day. To your point, Israel is controlling 53% of Gaza. There is no, by design, also, as you're kind of talking about, by design, Hamas is in place by default and by design. And you're right, like seeing it is all up to Trump, and he's not to say that he won't refocus on Gaza because of some pressure from the Saudis or Qataris or whatever else is going to happen, but he's not super interested in it right now. And unfortunately, we see how media cycles work too, that the kind of all the public discourse has also now kind of shifted to what's happening in Latin America. So there's a pessimistic note for us.
Maybe just to add, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is a disaster.
For sure. Yeah.
Number of trucks that were supposed to be coming in according to the plan are not
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
It's winter. They're not getting the tents, the accommodation that they need. And
Yeah.
of course, we have this crisis of the possibility of up to 36 major international NGOs having their work stopped because of new
Yeah.
regulation. So we can't forget that element of it either.
Yeah. And I'm going to share mine too, but I just want to say too, we should also remember, which this is a tragedy to me that this is kind of, I think, fallen off for a lot of people. There is still one hostage body that remains. And I think that, we have spoken for the past 2 years. I've heard you speak about it in media appearances. We've spoken about it at length with JSpaceCanada as well. But, the promise of a Jewish state is to protect our people, and we don't leave people behind, whether bodies are alive. And you mentioned this already. It is so wonderful that the hostages came home. It would have been great to see them come home much sooner and in much greater numbers still alive. But it's still not everybody. And I think that, for me, the promise of what Israel should be, we need to see all of those. We need to see all of those hostages come back, including the body of Ron Givley that is still there.
Agreed.
Um, and speaking of Israel and Israelis continuing to put up a fight, for me, the two things I think, since this Netanyahu government was elected, speculation as to when it is going to collapse and when Israel will next go to election have been circulating. I remember someone saying to me that this coalition wouldn't last more than 6 months, as kind of a way to, try to tamper those of us who were saying, hey, the alarms are sounding. We need to act. And I remember someone, leader in the kind of more Jewish establishment world, saying this is gonna be done in 6 months. We're not gonna have to worry about it. And now we see this is historic, right? We're going to see an Israeli governing coalition that's going to last likely their entire term, right? If elections happen in the fall of 2026, they may happen earlier. I still speak to Israelis who say like, oh, hopefully it'll be in the summer, but I don't know, will it be? And so definitely looking towards the elections whenever those may happen. But the biggest part, I think, of looking forward is also about, will these be free and fair elections? And I think that for as much as we've seen Israelis on the streets for the past 2+ years, protesting attempted judicial overhaul, and in some cases really actually having an effect, and we should really remember what an amazing force of fighting for democracy. We've been seeing a sustained fight for democracy on the streets of Israel that we are not seeing, for example, I don't think at the same level as in the U.S. So I take a lot of pride in the Jewish state and in my people for being out in the streets like that. But there was a survey from the Israeli Democracy Institute just last month, where the majority of Israelis, 65.5% of Israelis said that, like, yeah, they think that the next elections are going to be free and fair elections. And that's interesting to me. I mean, I think that, for me, I'm looking at not only the fight for democracy as it relates to this governing coalition and the specific attempts at, judicial coup and what they've been trying to advance, but also like how we, not just Israelis, but all of us actually, like how we understand what a continued liberal democracy looks like, and do we recognize when it's collapsing enough to fight for it, right? And I think that the second thing that I would say, and I'm curious to hear how you're feeling about this as well, is the situation in the West Bank, something that has also rapidly deteriorated and escalated over the past 2 years, where we've been focused on Gaza, and we see you know the increase of settler violence, and not just the increase of settler violence, but the severity of it, right? The impunity with which Palestinians are, killed, violently attacked, forced from their homes, displaced. We've seen incidents of settler violence. I think already 2025 has been the highest incidence of settler violence. That was already the case before the end of the year. So going into 2026, I don't know that we're going to see anything much different. Also need to stop deluding ourselves regarding this idea of it just being a few bad apples, because if it's a few bad apples, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to stop them? And I think that situation, what happens in the West Bank, talking about liberal democracy, talking about free and fair elections in Israel, and what do we see for the future of Israeli democracy, what happens in the West Bank, and where Israel acts with might makes right and acts with that impunity. I think on the flip side of where we can use it as an example, I think it is a stark warning for just the impunity with which strong governments can act.
I think on the elections, um, the worst fear with respect to concerns about free and fair elections, I think, is related to the Arab parties. As we know, the Arab population, 20%, possible 15 seats in the Knesset. If there is any efforts by the current government to somehow restrict Arabs from voting, then you do call into question the fairness of the elections, of course. And in addition to that, it seems pretty clear that if the opposition wants to defeat Bibi Netanyahu and his current coalition, that they are going to need the votes of the Arab parties in order to get more than, let's say, just 60 seats, which is what they had last time, and in part why their government was defeated, because they didn't have a strong enough majority. So I'm hopeful that the elections will be free and fair, as you suggested. We don't know when they're going to be. There are plenty of issues out there, whether or not there's going to be an independent commission, the responsibility of Netanyahu and his government for what happened on October 7 and subsequently. Obviously, exemption of the Haredim from serving in the army is another major issue. And Bibi, of course, will use the comments that Donald Trump made in his last press conferences, the two when Bibi last visited Washington, to say to Israelis that he's the only person to keep Israel safe, et cetera, et cetera. He will use Iran and the attacks on Hezbollah and efforts in Syria, which all of which have positives and negatives, in an effort to try and win that election. I think just to end on the election side, it's got to be one of the most crucial elections that Israel has ever held. Because I think if for some reason and somehow the current coalition wins that election, then the question of the judicial coup moving forward, the question of de facto annexation of the West Bank moving forward, which you alluded to, and a massive polarization, increased polarization in the country, I think will take place. And your comments about liberal democracy, we will have seen really, if not the end of liberal democracy in Israel, we'll have seen 3 years plus however long the next Bibi government lasts of attacks on liberal democracy. So it's going to be an extremely important election, and whether it happens I don't think it's going to happen in the spring now. It may happen in May, June, or may go all the way to October. It's going to be crucial for Israelis to come out. And I would just agree with you completely. Israelis have been protesting for 3 years. In America, where their constitution is also seriously under threat, and we don't have to go into all that Donald Trump and ICE and others have done, we've really seen 2 large protests. But Israelis are out every weekend, whether it was the judicial coup, getting the hostages back, ending the war, now, of course, arguing for an independent commission of inquiry as to what happened on October 7, etc. So I agree with you 100%. Israelis are really demonstrating that for them, their democracy is important. I guess for you and I and others on the progressive side, we wish that they could be as active in calling for a two-state solution, an end to the settlement violence that you described, the settlement expansion that is going on, the threats to the two-state solution. But I think you and I both understand that for Israelis, what they've gone through in this past few years with October 7, with Iran, with Hezbollah rockets, that they don't really have space in their hearts or in their protest abilities to be moving forward. Two states is certainly not on their minds, and it's going to take some time and new leadership for that to become a reality. And I will just reiterate what you said, Maytal, the level of impunity in the West Bank, largely because the two ministers were responsible for the West Bank in some way. Smotrich, who is given actual responsibility for management of the West Bank, and Ben-Gvir, who's responsible for public security, who are both pro-settlement and who have done absolutely nothing to punish those responsible for violence that we see on video, in the media, people being killed and beaten and their homes being destroyed. Nothing essentially is happening. Not only is nothing happening, but it's clear that the police and the IDF who are there are doing nothing while this violence is taking place. And that is, in many ways, this breakdown of the rule of law is really frightening. And it counters this idea that there are Israelis fighting for a liberal democracy. That is the epitome of authoritarianism and a kind of fascism when people can destroy the lives and livelihoods of others without any recourse to the rule of law. They're simply at the mercy of violent settlers. So that's something we'll watch going forward.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and as we've seen, obviously, what happens in the West Bank does not stay in the West Bank, and so to your point, we do want to see Israelis make that connection a little bit more, even if only for their own self-interest, because we see how that same authoritarianism and fascism creeps into Israel and the Green Line as well. I want to ask you, we talked a little bit about the Gaza ceasefire, but let's talk about it a little bit more, because I think that one of the places where there might be some confusion that you can help us untangle is regarding, you talked about disarming Hamas and what that actually looks like and who does that. And it's a quagmire for Israel and Hamas, because you have Hamas saying, well, we're not going to disarm until these conditions are met or these things happen, and Israel saying we're not going to meet those conditions until you disarm. I don't think, my understanding is that there really hasn't been situations in history where we see a terror group just completely disarm right off the bat, or such an organization just completely disarm. But as you also pointed out, neither Israel nor Hamas are very interested in really pursuing phase two in good faith. So what would have to happen? What would have to change, or what outside pressures would be needed to actually move us to that phase two and see the disarmament of Hamas as definitely a crucial step that needs to happen, but needs to come with other conditions as well?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, they're not going to fully disarm overnight, and Israel's not going to withdraw overnight. What we need is a step-by-step decommissioning and disarmament of Hamas, and a step-by-step withdrawal of Israeli troops beyond their current yellow line. And what will it take for the beginning to happen? Well, Hamas has said various things. I mean, they've said we're never going to disarm. They've said we're only going to disarm once there's a PA technocratic government in place that we can work with. And they've said we're not disarming until Israel starts to withdraw. I think what has to happen is Donald Trump, as I mentioned before, has to put the screws to Qatar and Turkey, who are really the main sponsors of Hamas, to say, okay, you've got to begin. You've got to get rid of the big weapons, the RPGs, the rockets. You've got to, decommission them or hand them over. You can retain what you say you need in order to protect yourselves, because we know there are forces in Gaza that are funded by Israel that are entirely opposed, not only gangs, but actual families that are opposed to Hamas and that have been funded by Israel, who would like nothing better for Hamas to put down their arms and then wipe them out or force them out. So we really do need Turkey, Qatar, who host and finance Hamas, to put the screws to them and say, we need to begin this. Because if you don't begin this, we're not going to get the stabilization force in place. Israel will not move. The Gazan people will continue to suffer because Israel will not change its position vis-a-vis the humanitarian assistance, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, on the Israeli side, Israel's got to be told to stop shooting and killing people that come somehow close to the yellow line. Over 400 people, any number of children, have already been killed in shootings, and they have to signal more clearly that they are indeed ready to move, as opposed to suggesting that they're going to start construction of apartment buildings in their 53% and encourage vetted Palestinians to come and live there. I mean, these are pipe dreams that only real estate developers and this coalition would think up, because I don't think Palestinians really want to move into another occupied territory of Israel, and I don't think anybody's going to start building rental apartments in an area when they simply don't know what the future is. So step by step, somebody's got to start. And once again, it comes to having Donald Trump and his envoys engaged again, and putting real pressure on all sides to get into phase two.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess there's no point in speculating what what will come from Donald Trump, because it is a fool's errand to try to predict. So our fates are very much at the hands of him, which is, I think, a scary prospect for a lot of people right now.
Agreed.
Let's end our conversation today by looking a little bit at what Canada is doing or has already done, and what we want Canada to do more of. So we saw just before the end of the year that Canada issued two statements. They had a statement condemning Israel from blocking NGOs and humanitarian organizations from getting aid into the Gaza Strip. And they also had a statement condemning the announcement of new construction in the occupied West Bank. I think 19 new settlements, and then 4 that had been evacuated as part of the disengagement plan, or that are now kind of reinstituted as illegal outposts. And when we talk about illegal outposts, I mean illegal by Israel standards as well, or were. So it's great to see that condemnation from Canada. And you mentioned earlier that Canada, yes, is under this Carney government, is kind of saying more. And in some cases, we see them also doing more. And we applaud what they've done with sanctions and with some of the concrete actions that they've taken. What do you see as something hopeful that the Canadian government is doing? Where do you see them doing work that impresses you? And where do you want to see them do more?
Well, I just following up on what you said, I was happily surprised that early on The government did join with other Western countries in condemning what was going on in the West Bank and calling for more humanitarian assistance. Um, JSpace, you and I supported the government's recognition of Palestine fairly early on, again, joined by many other Western countries, as we know. And then, as you mentioned, we've seen two more instances where the government, along with a number of other Western countries, have been exceedingly concerned about what's going on in the West Bank. And now, with the decision by Israel to potentially end the involvement of over 35 extremely well-respected NGOs who are essentially delivering the humanitarian assistance that is much needed in Gaza. And if their work is prevented, then there will be a crisis, an even greater crisis than there is now. Um, what else can the government do? I mean, one speaks of trade sanctions. There are a limited number of tools. There's the UN Security Council, which is unlikely to act because the United States will exercise a veto. Then there are group actions that can be taken, sanctions, trade sanctions, but it's proven very difficult on the part of the EU, Israel's largest trading partner, with whom Canada and Scandinavia and Australia and New Zealand might join, to agree on trade sanctions. On the one hand, for example, Germany has stopped the export of offensive weapons to Israel. On the other hand, they've just announced a major purchase from Israel of arms. And Greece and Italy have also done the same. And this has been, pointed out by people who, you say that Israel is increasingly isolated. Well, on the one hand, they're isolated and being criticized, and on the other hand, people are buying their arms, and I'm sure buying their cyber technology, etc. So, and there's really no point in Canada on its own imposing trade sanctions. We're a minor player in terms of bilateral trade. We're more important if we join with others. But I do think if the West is serious about protecting the possibility of a two-state solution, something has to be done about the de facto annexation. It's not enough for Donald Trump to say, de jure, a declaration of annexation is not acceptable and you can't do it. Meanwhile, on a daily basis, more and more land is being grabbed. And there is no question that at some point it is going to be very, very difficult to undo what has been done. It's going to be difficult for an Israeli government. I still believe that despite 750,000 settlers, there are real possibilities for removing many of them. The settlement blocks will remain 500,000, but if this keeps up, that won't be possible. So what does Canada do? I think it has to keep talking to its partners, and I think it has to start thinking about more action on its part. I mean, you can withdraw your ambassador, you can ask the Israeli ambassador to go home, expressing your concern about specific actions. There are sanctions of various kinds. Obviously, sanctioning the settlers and the settler organizations, which Canada and others have done, is important and should continue because they're at the height of it. And sanctioning ministers who promote and support these activities is important. But it's not an easy question, and I just hope that the West can get its act together in opposing what's happening, especially in the West Bank and the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
So I'm going to offer a bit of a clarification for what you're saying versus what JSpace as an organization calls for. And then I want to kind of maybe not necessarily push back, but kind of try to look at it from a different angle. I will note that as an organization, JSpace Canada, we don't call for sanctions. We call for a ban on trade with settlements, not a blanket ban with Israel. Our belief is very much we are pro-Israel, with Israel being Israel within the Green Line, and we oppose the occupation. I do think that there's very interesting questions that arise in terms of, we just talked about this earlier, in terms of how these things don't just stay, these things migrate. There is no border to authoritarianism and fascism. And so those questions remain, but there's I think two reasons. The first is that we do want to make a distinction between Israel within the Green Line, Israel proper, which we support and believe in and continue to uphold and believe that Israel has a right to exist as a sovereign Jewish state, and what is happening in the West Bank, which we oppose, and the occupation, which we oppose. So that's one thing in terms of where JSpace sits as an organization. But the other thing that I would like to ask in that regard is, you're already saying that it is challenging, and I agree with you. For JSpace as a pro-Israel organization and an organization that really cares about the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, are there ways that we can have some sort of influence, whether as Jews or Canadian citizens or the Canadian government, that are more carrot than stick? Where are the places where we can act less punitively and more encouragingly, or do those not exist at all with this current Netanyahu administration?
Well, frankly, I think they do not exist because all efforts to to criticize the recognition of a Palestinian state, things that we did, which the government didn't agree with, have been characterized as supporting terrorism, as basically adding to anti-Semitism around the world. Um, Essentially, the Bibi coalition doesn't want to hear criticism of anything it's doing. And unfortunately, in my view, the establishment Jewish organizations, especially in Canada, it's a bit less in the United States, but especially in Canada, refuse to put any pressure on Israel to change its positions. I don't know whether they're speaking to them quietly. I tend to doubt it. But they take the exact same view that Bibi does, which is you can't criticize Israel because somehow it supports Hamas or it's contributing to anti-Semitism, whereas certainly my view, I'm not speaking for JSpace now, is that if Jews around the world don't stand up for liberal values and the liberal democracy in Israel, whether it be on the question of the judicial coup or illegal activity in the West Bank, if Jews around the world are not saying anything about it and the rest of the world is looking at the establishment Jewish community, which by not saying anything seems to approve what's going on, then you've got a problem. You've got a problem where non-Jews around the world look at Jews and say, well, where is your allegiance? You're a liberal Democrat in Canada, but it's okay what's going on in the West Bank, or it's okay to withhold humanitarian assistance for 11 weeks in Gaza? Or what's going on here? There's a dissonance between Jews and Tikkun Olam and what they've understood Jews to represent, and understanding where Jews have come from, and a sense that you can't criticize Israel because, God forbid, it's going to create anti-Semitism. I think it's just the opposite, frankly. So I don't have any simple answers for what can be done. But I do think that if the diaspora, in its strength, said to Israel, this is not acceptable and this is not necessary, and if they believed, as JSpace does and as many progressives do, that Israel's security going forward is really dependent on two states. It's not the threat, it is the answer if it's done obviously in a way that protects Israel. And that's the only way we advocate for two states. If Israel is protected and secure and its people can live in peace, then that's where we're at. But I'm afraid the mainstream community either doesn't believe in two states anymore, or doesn't, continues with the argument there's no partner, or uh, simply doesn't want to engage publicly on it because criticism of Israel is bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you raise a good point in terms of the challenge of bringing up carrots instead of sticks. We saw, I think that what came from the Carney government when recognizing Palestinian statehood was probably one of the best statements about reasons for recognition, because it mentioned two states. It mentioned, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. It mentioned the brutal Hamas terror attacks of October 7th and how Hamas cannot remain in power. And we saw that even with all of that language, which is the language that, even the Jewish establishment community purports to support, that kind of went out the window, and the focus was just on recognition of Palestinian statehood, as if none of those other conditions or caveats existed. And so you're right to say that we broadly as a community are not doing ourselves any favors when we can't acknowledge where those carrots are and where those benefits are. And I think I'll use this opportunity maybe just to tease out, in the coming weeks, we're going to be releasing our annual survey of the Canadian Jewish community, which we do in partnership with New Israel Fund of Canada and Canadian Friends of Peace Now. There's some numbers in there that I think are optimistic. There's some others that I think are maybe gave us a little bit, reason to pause or reason for concern, but we never sugarcoat any of the data, and we never use our own biases. We want to look at the community where it actually is. But it is interesting to see that we continue to see a majority of the Canadian Jewish community say that the best solution for the conflict is a two-state solution. We see the Canadian Jewish community, actually, the support for sanctions on violent settlers from the Canadian government has gone up from the last time that we asked that question. Even with the past couple years of war, we see that people still are, supportive of Canada taking some action when it comes to issues like settler violence and things that, to your point, things that really reflect poorly on us as, a Jewish community that supports a Jewish state, not this Jewish state, not a Jewish state that acts with impunity and that allows violence, just in the same way that we would not be proud to be Canadians in a Canada that permits and turns a blind eye to anti-Semitism. And so, so I think that being a bit brave as a diaspora community in terms of seeing where those carrots and where those benefits are actually in our favor and are actually saying we care about the security of Israel, we care about the future of Israel, and being able to recognize, to your point, that a two-state solution is the answer. It is not a threat. It is actually the only way to have that Israel in peace and security is an independent state of Israel alongside an independent state of Palestine, which is something that we talk about often.
Yeah, and we do support the state of Israel. What we're criticizing these days, of course, is the current government of Israel. We are solidly and strongly and vehemently Zionist, and we want Israel to exist, and we want it to be strong, and we want it to be liberal, and we want it to be democratic. And even if it isn't liberal and democratic, we will continue to support the state. But we're not very happy with the current government, and we shouldn't be.
Yes. Yeah. We wanted to see, we were raised on a certain idea of what this state should look like, and I don't think that we're so willing to throw that out the window, because of a blind nationalism. I think that our understanding of what that state is goes much deeper than just any one government. On that note, anything else you want to add? Anything we haven't talked about that you want to talk about today?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. I look forward to speaking to you in a couple of more weeks. I'm sure we'll have something to talk about because it's never dull in Israel or in the community. So thanks so much for initiating this and for hosting it. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good, Jon. Thank you so much.